My son leaned across the table and said, "Mom, your music is just noise." Laughter rippled from his wife, like thin glass cracking. I froze with the fork in my hand, roast cooling on the plate. I am Margaret Lawson, 72, sitting at a Thanksgiving dinner that should have been warm. Instead, it felt like January crept into the dining room. The cinnamon rolls I baked were untouched, their sugar glaze stiff and cold. My son Daniel carved the turkey with grand gestures, but his eyes never softened. They looked at me as if I were an old instrument, useless, out of tune. I tried to swallow, but the food turned to dust in my throat. Noise. That word echoed against the piano keys of my memory. Noise. As if the years of teaching, the lessons laid into the night, the worn ivory keys under my fingers, the aching wrists. As if all of that meant nothing. I looked at my granddaughter Anna across the table. She did not laugh. Her wide eyes darted from me to her father, as if she knew a line had been crossed. But she was only 16. Silence was safer for her. Daniel's wife leaned closer, smirking. "She keeps playing the same old tune," she said. The words fell like ashes onto the mashed potatoes, spoiling even their warmth. I thought of my husband's voice, gone 10 winters now. "Don't stop creating," he had whispered in his last days. "One day your notes will outlive us." I clung to those words as my shield, but tonight, even they trembled in my heart. My hands shook under the table. I gripped my napkin so hard it tore. A simple white cloth now split like the bond between mother and son. I remembered the sacrifices. Tutoring other children for a few dollars, walking home in the snow to pay for Daniel's lessons. And now he sat in his suit. Successful manager, mocking the very music that fed him. Goodness, the irony burned. I raised him on rhythm, and he now dismissed rhythm as worthless. I built him with melody, and he now crushed melody beneath his fork. I forced a smile, but inside I was breaking like old strings. "Noise," he said. "Just noise." My eyes blurred. The lamp above the table swayed slightly, casting shadows across the untouched pies. It felt like a funeral more than a feast. Anna whispered faintly, "Couldn't enough." Just one word, soft, but enough to keep me anchored. I breathed once, slow. The room smelled of burnt gravy and disappointment. The chatter blurred. My son's voice droned about business, investments, success. Success built on silence. Silence from the woman who gave him everything. I wondered, is dignity meant to vanish after 70, or does it become sharper, like a note held against the wind? I looked down at my hands. Wrinkled, veined, trembling. But these hands still carried songs. These hands still knew truth. Daniel clinked his glass for attention. "Let's toast," he said. His smile never reached me. I raised my water glass, but inside, a storm was building. I thought, maybe music isn't noise. Maybe noise is their laughter, hollow and cruel. Maybe my silence is louder than their mockery. I sat back in my chair, the roast now stone cold. And I asked myself a question that still burns tonight. Should I fight back or walk away? Dear folks listening, what would you do if your own child erased your worth? Would you stay quiet, or would you rise? Tell me. Comment below. Because at 72, I still believe dignity has its own melody. And I need to know if you hear it too. The night after Thanksgiving, I sat alone at my piano. The house was silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. My fingers rested on the worn keys, their ivory chipped from decades of use. The lamp cast a soft circle of yellow, warming the sheet music on the stand. As I touched the keys, memory pulled me back. Not to the sharp laughter of Daniel, but to the first years of teaching. It was 1978, Asheville still sleepy, mountain air crisp outside my small window. I remember the scent of chalk dust mixed with polish on the piano bench. Children gathered in my living room, their little shoes muddy from play. I guided their tiny fingers through scales, patient, proud, hopeful. Those lessons paid the rent, bought bread, kept us afloat. But more than money, they gave me purpose. When the last student left, I would linger at the keyboard. I played for myself, weaving the melodies that no one asked for. And every night, my husband would sit in the doorway listening. He never interrupted. He just nodded, as if to say, keep going. I remember one winter when the heater broke. I taught with gloves, my breath visible in the room. Still I smiled, because Daniel was growing. because we were surviving. I told myself the cold was temporary, but the music eternal. When Daniel was 12, he stormed into the room. "Do you have to practice all night?" he complained. I looked at him, "My boy, my sacrifice." "Some a day, you'll understand," I said softly. But he rolled his eyes, slammed his door. Even then, the distance was starting. My husband tried to bridge it. He left me notes tucked between sheet music. One said, "Don't stop creating one day. Your notes will outlive us." I still keep that paper in a drawer by the piano. Its ink has faded, but the words cut clear as glass. I pressed a low chord tonight, and the vibration filled the room. It rattled the old metronome, tick-tocking unevenly on the shelf. The sound was warm, yet it broke my heart. Because back then, music was our glue. Now, it had become the wedge driving us apart. I closed my eyes. The memory of laughter, gentle, not cruel, surrounded me. Students clapping when they mastered Twinkle, Twinkle. My husband humming along to my nocturnes. Even the tired nights, the ache in my wrists, carried sweetness. I opened them again to silence. The lamp flickered, the room was empty. The piano stood loyal, but my family did not. I laid my hand on the wood, cold under my palm. For a moment, I almost believed it could answer back. I remember the first recital I organized for my students. The church hall smelled of wax and polished pews. Parents sat with programs in their laps, whispering with pride. My heart pounded as each child played their piece. When the evening ended, they applauded for the students, not for me. I stood in the back, clapping with the rest, pretending the ache in my chest was joy. I never wanted fame, only a little recognition. But recognition never came. I gave that night to Daniel as well. He was dressed in his new shoes, shining under the lights. I watched him smile as other parents congratulated him. And I thought, maybe all of this sacrifice would be worth it. Years slipped past. I turned down invitations to perform in small ensembles. I told myself Daniel needs me home, Daniel needs the money. Every time I closed a door on my own dreams, I opened another for him. After my husband died, the house fell into a strange quiet. The piano stood tall, but its sound felt heavier. I played nocturnes alone, sometimes breaking down in the middle of a phrase. Tears blurred the notes until the page looked like rain. Daniel visited less often. When he came, he carried new suits, new deals, new arrogance. He never asked about my students, never asked about the music. Only about money, about the house, about security. To him, my art was a leftover hobby, like knitting or crossword puzzles. But it was not leftover. It was the marrow of my bones. The language that kept me alive when the bed was empty, when the nights stretched too long. I pressed another chord tonight, deep, trembling through the wooden floor. For a moment, I could almost hear my husband's breath beside me. I could almost believe his promise again, that the notes would outlive us. Then Daniel's voice returned in memory. "Mum, your music is just noise." I gripped the edge of the piano, the varnish cool under my palm. Noise. The insult echoed inside the house, louder than the chord itself. I leaned forward, resting my forehead against the music stand. The paper smelled faintly of dust and old ink. I whispered to the empty room, "If no one listens, should I still play?" The question lingered in the silence, like a note held too long in the air, refusing to fade. The first time he mocked me in public, it was at his own house. Daniel invited colleagues for a dinner, polished and grand. Their laughter filled the modern kitchen, walls gleaming steel and glass. I stood near the counter, holding a tray of hors d'oeuvres. Someone asked about hobbies. One woman spoke about golf, another about travel. Daniel smirked and said, "My mother still plays piano. She thinks she's Mozart." Oh, the group chuckled, polite but cruel. My cheeks burned. I gripped the tray tighter, fingers pressing into the china. The room smelled of red wine and garlic bread. Yet all I tasted was ash in my mouth. Noise. Again that word flashed behind my eyes. I forced a smile, but my throat locked. Inside, I thought I gave you lessons, boy. I paid with my wrists, my back, my nights, and you repay me with laughter. One man raised his glass. "Still, music keeps the mind sharp," he offered. But Daniel waved him off. "She spends hours on old keys." Waste of time, really. He laughed louder, pulling others into his circle. My heart pounded like the pedal struck too hard. I wanted to speak, but words tangled inside me. I imagined saying, "Noise raised you? Noise fed you?" Instead, silence strangled me. I lowered the tray onto the table, hands trembling. Anna was there, lingering at the edge. Her eyes darted to me, then away afraid. I saw her lips part as if she wanted to defend me. But she stayed quiet, young and uncertain. I could not blame her. The chandelier glistened above, its crystals scattering light like mocking stars. I felt very small, as though the room had grown too large. Their voices swirled, a current of success and arrogance where my music had no place. Daniel poured another glass of wine. "Mom once wanted to compose?" he said, smirking. "But you know how dreams fade." Laughter rippled, sharper this time. I pressed my nails into my palm, drawing a sting. Better pain in my hand than in my chest. Inside, a thought flickered. Perhaps dignity is not gifted by children. Perhaps it must be reclaimed in silence. I excused myself, voice shaking. "Restroom," I said simply. Nobody looked twice. As I stepped away, the laughter followed, clinging to my shoulders like smoke. In the hallway mirror, I saw myself. A woman with tired eyes, lipstick fading, but still holding a spine of steel. I whispered to the glass, "They think it's a joke, but I am not finished." The chandelier's light still echoed in my eyes. The sting of wine and laughter filled my lungs. And for the first time I wondered, what would happen if I let the music answer them all? I returned to the table after splashing cold water on my face. The mirror still showed my red cheeks, but I forced composure. Guests leaned in closer now, laughter flowing like cheap champagne. Daniel raised his voice above them all, eager to perform. "You know," he began, "Mom once entered a local contest." He paused for effect, smirk curving his lips. "She played her heart out, but forgot half the notes. We left before the end. Embarrassing, really." The table roared. Forks clinked, glasses tapped, heads nodded at his tale. I stood frozen, my body stiff as the piano bench back home. My breath caught like a wrong chord struck too hard. The truth? That contest had been 35 years ago. I had rushed from teaching, exhausted, still clutching chalk on my hands. I stumbled, yes, but I finished. He was 12. He remembered only the stumble, never the courage. I wanted to shout across the table, "Those lessons paid for your shoes! That piano kept you fed!" Without my music, there was no Daniel. But the words stayed chained inside. My lips trembled, my throat ached, but no sound emerged. Anna's eyes met mine again. She was pale, clutching her napkin, silent. Her father's laughter rang in her ears too, but she was powerless in that storm. The chandelier flickered above, light bouncing cruelly across the polished silverware. I felt stripped bare, as though every guest could see the years I had hidden in my music. My husband's words returned like a whisper, "Don't stop creating." But tonight, even that felt fragile. The room pressed down on me, their grins sharp as broken glass. Daniel leaned back, swirling his wine. "She still believes her notes matter," he said, voice thick with arrogance. "Can you imagine?" He louder again, louder, crueler. I clenched my hands in my lap, nails digging half moons into my palms. Pain grounded me, but shame burned hotter than fire. I thought, almost bitterly, if dignity were currency, my son would leave me bankrupt. But somewhere deep, a chord still hummed. Low, steady, waiting. I rose slowly, chair scraping against the hardwood. "Excuse me?" I said. My voice was quiet, but the room hushed for a moment, every eye turned toward me, expecting another weak smile. Instead, I simply met Daniel's gaze. His smirk faltered just slightly, just enough for me to see a crack in the mask. I left the table without another word, the sound of their laughter chasing me down the hallway. At the door, I paused. The night air seeped in, crisp and cold. Stars glittered above, unbothered by mockery, untouched by arrogance. And I asked myself, what would you do if your own child mocked you? Would you bear the silence, or would you let the music answer? The papers came a week after the dinner. A thick envelope slid through my mailbox, heavy with promise and threat. The return address bore Daniel's law firm. My stomach tightened before I even tore it open. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I once graded music sheets. The wood smelled faintly of polish and old coffee. I spread the documents across the surface, their neat lines and clauses stretching like chains. Power of attorney, the heading read. My name filled the blanks in stiff, impersonal type. If I signed, Daniel would gain full control of my accounts, my home, even decisions about my health. I pressed a hand to my chest. The paper felt colder than winter air. Each page whispered that I was no longer capable, that I was an old woman ready to be managed. Later that evening, Daniel arrived, his cologne sharp, his smile practiced. "Mom, it's for your own good," he said. "You don't need the stress of bills. Let me handle things." I studied him. The boy I once fed from piano lessons was now a man arranging my erasure. My throat tightened. "Daniel, I can still pay my own bills." He chuckled, low, dismissive. "Mom, this is just paperwork. You're 72. Mistakes happen. One wrong check, one forgotten payment. And everything could collapse." I stared at the pen he slid toward me. It gleamed under the kitchen light, like a blade disguised as silver. My fingers hovered, trembling. I thought of the nights I worked by candlelight, teaching scales to restless children. Those dollars kept Daniel in shoes, kept food on his plate. And now, with a stroke of ink, he could claim it all. The refrigerator hummed behind me, steady, uncaring. Outside, wind scraped the shutters. I pressed the pen to the line, my name beginning to form. Then my hand froze. I heard my husband's voice again. "Don't stop creating?" His words echoed, but tonight they meant more. Don't stop deciding. Don't stop being alive. The pen slipped from my grasp, clattering onto the table. Daniel frowned. "Mom, what's the problem?" he asked, tone sharp now. I looked at the signature line, blank and waiting. One mark and everything I had would vanish. One mark, and dignity would be surrendered. My heart pounded, louder than the hum of the refrigerator, louder than the wind outside. I whispered to myself, "Is this protection or betrayal?" And I left the pen lying there, ink unspent, decision trembling in the silence. Daniel tapped the table, impatient. "Mum, you're making this harder than it needs to be." His tone, no longer polished, carried steel beneath the words. He slid the papers closer again, pen poised beside them. I kept my eyes fixed on the signature line. It stared back like an open grave. "Why now?" I asked, voice thin. "You never cared about my bills before." He sighed, rolling his eyes as if I were a child. "Because mistakes have consequences. Last month you overdrew your account. Don't you remember?" My pulse quickened. I never overdrew. Every check was balanced, every receipt kept. Confusion swirled, but then suspicion burned through. I whispered, "Daniel, what did you do?" His smile froze for a fraction. A crack in the mask. "Banks make errors." "Mom," he said quickly. I fixed it before it became a problem. I rose from the table, chair scraping the floor. The documents fluttered, pages rustling like restless ghosts. I walked to the desk drawer in the corner, pulled out my passbook, faded but familiar. The numbers did not lie. Withdrawals, large ones, scattered across the last 3 months. Not mine. My chest tightened as if a fist had closed around it. My sacrifices, my savings, already bleeding away. I turned back, the book trembling in my hands. "Daniel, these amounts, did you take this money?" My voice cracked. The silence between us answered before he did. He looked away, jaw set. "It's temporary. Investments, opportunities. You wouldn't understand? I'll double it, maybe triple. But you can't just sit on money forever." I staggered back against the counter. The cool tile pressed into my spine. All the years of lessons, the winters without heat, the pennies saved from tutoring, they had vanished into his ambition. Noise. That word again echoing. But tonight it meant more. To him, my music was noise. And now my life savings, just numbers to shuffle. I clutched the passbook, its paper edges cutting my palm. A bitter thought surged. I raised him with rhythm, and he turned that rhythm into theft. Daniel softened his voice, the manipulative charm sliding back into place. "Mom, sign the papers. I'll manage everything. You can relax, play your piano, forget the stress. Relax." The word nearly broke me. There was no rest and surrender, only erasure. I gathered the papers, folded them once, and pushed them back. "No," I said. My voice was low but steady. His eyes widened, anger sparking. "Don't be foolish," he hissed. You'll ruin everything if you fight me? I met his stare, the weight of betrayal burning hotter than shame. Everything is already ruined, I whispered. The refrigerator hummed louder, a hollow witness to the fracture between us. And I thought, if my own son can take what I bled for, what safety remains at all? The question hung in the air, heavy as the unsigned line on the page. The house grew quieter after the papers. Not the peaceful quiet of morning coffee, but the kind that pressed against your ribs, leaving you breathless. Daniel stopped calling for days at a time. When he did, his words were clipped sharp, always circling back to money. His wife no longer visited at all. Their absence echoed louder than any insult. I wandered from room to room, touching the piano, the bookshelf, the framed photos. The dust gathered faster now, as though neglect had a will of its own. The scent of stale air lingered, a reminder that laughter no longer lived here. At night I sat by the window, watching porch lights flicker across the street. Neighbors waved at passing cars, but no one came up my walkway. The mailbox filled with bills, but never with letters. The refrigerator hummed, steady as grief. I ate alone, soup cooling in the bowl. The spoon clinked against the ceramic, an accidental metronome to solitude. Once, I reached for the phone to call an old friend. My finger hovered over the number, then pulled back. What would I say? That my son was stripping me of dignity, that I was vanishing in my own home? Silence was safer. The church choir rehearsed across town. I heard the faint bells on Thursday evenings, their chimes floating through the mountain air. I used to be there, leading warm-ups, laughter spilling out with the notes. Now, I stayed inside, afraid of the questions in their eyes. One afternoon, the house felt too heavy. I opened the piano lid, struck a chord so deep the floorboards shook. The sound lingered, then died into the walls without witness. I shut the lid again, my hands trembling at the loss. Then came a knock, soft, hesitant. I opened the door to find Anna, her backpack slung over one shoulder. Her eyes searched mine, uncertain but kind. "Grandma, can I stay a while?" she asked. We sat together in the kitchen. She stirred sugar into her tea, the clinking spoon somehow brighter than silence. She asked about school assignments, but her gaze kept drifting to the untouched piano. Finally, she whispered, "Dad says you worry too much." But I don't believe him. Her fingers fidgeted with the handle of her cup. I reached across, covering her small hand with my wrinkled one. The warmth startled me after so much cold. For the first time in weeks, I felt less invisible. When she rose to leave, she lingered at the door. The hallway light caught her face, earnest and afraid at once. She leaned close and whispered, "Grandma, I'll help." The words landed like a spark in a house that had forgotten fire. After Anna left that evening, the silence returned heavier than before. Her words still glowed in my chest. "Grandma, I'll help." But once the door closed, shadows filled the house again. The next Sunday, I tried to go back to church. I dressed in my navy coat, polished the buttons, and walked slowly into the sanctuary. The organ thundered, hymns rose, yet eyes turned when I entered. Whispers spread like smoke. A friend of Daniel's wife leaned close to another pew. Their glances cut through me sharper than cold air. I sat alone at the edge, singing softly, my voice drowned beneath the choir. After the service, no one approached. No invitations for lunch, no gentle questions. Only nods, curt and distant. It was as if my son's version of me, a confused, incapable, troublesome, had already taken root in their minds. Walking home, I felt the mountain wind push hard against my coat. Leaves skittered across the sidewalk, brittle and brown. The town I had lived in for decades suddenly felt foreign. Even the postman hurried past without lifting his head. That night I sat in the living room with the lights off. The piano loomed in the corner, its outline a shadow against the curtained window. I couldn't bear to open it. The keys seemed to mock me now, white smiles hiding betrayal. The phone rang once, an old friend's number. I lifted the receiver, but before I could speak, her voice said quickly, "Margaret, I can't get involved in family matters. I hope you understand." Then the line clicked dead. I lowered the receiver slowly, its dial tone buzzing like an empty hive. Another door closed, another wall around me. Days blurred. Meals went uneaten, laundry piled untouched. The fridge hummed, the clock ticked, but life itself felt stalled. When Anna returned midweek, she carried a sketchbook under her arm. She drew while I brewed tea, her pencil scratching against the paper. She showed me a sketch of my hands, veined, wrinkled, yet steady on the keys. "See, they're not useless," she whispered. I smiled through tears, pulling her into a gentle embrace. She was the single thread tying me to hope. Without her, the rooms would be nothing but tombs of memory. After she left that night, I stood in the hallway, the house too dark, too still. I pressed my forehead against the cool wall, eyes closing, breath shallow. Only Anna believes me. Only Anna sees me. The thought circled, a fragile melody in a world gone deaf. And I whispered into the dark, if she lets go, then I disappear. The invitation came in a glossy envelope. Daniel's annual company gala, cocktails, speeches, live music. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope. Music, after all, belonged on nights like this. I pressed my only good dress, navy with silver threads glinting faintly under the lamp. Anna helped polish my shoes, her hands careful and bright. "Grandma, they'll love hearing you play," she said. Her faith lifted me higher than any applause could. When we arrived at the hotel ballroom, crystal chandeliers blazed with golden light. The air smelled of champagne and roasted beef, a heavy perfume of wealth and pride. Laughter rose in polished waves, echoing against marble floors. I spotted the grand piano near the stage. Its black lacquer gleamed like a promise. I imagined my fingers pressing the keys, the melody floating across the crowd, reminding them music was not noise but life. Daniel greeted guests with a manager's smile. When he saw me, his expression stiffened. "Mom, glad you came," he said through his teeth. I stepped closer, voice soft. "I'd like to play tonight, just one piece." His eyes widened, then narrowed. "Absolutely not," he hissed. "This is my event. Don't embarrass me." The words sliced cleaner than any blade. I staggered, clutching my clutch bag tight. But Daniel, the piano, knew. His voice rose just enough for two colleagues nearby to hear. They glanced, smirks tugging at their lips. "She'll turn the gala into a recital," one whispered. Heat rushed into my cheeks. I looked at the piano again, its keys glowing under the spotlight, so close, yet sealed away. "Noise," he once said, and tonight silence was his verdict. Anna tugged at my sleeve. "Grandma, it's okay," she whispered, but her eyes betrayed anger, a fire too young to hide. I forced a smile for the guests, but my hands trembled. The glass in my grip sloshed, champagne spilling onto my dress. Laughter rippled around us, not cruel yet, but close. Daniel leaned down, his breath sharp with wine. "You sit, Mom. Smile. Don't even think about touching those keys." I nodded, though my stomach churned. Inside, thoughts clashed like cymbals. I raised you with melody. I gave you everything. And now you silence me like a child. I sank into a chair near the back. The music hired for the night began to play, a polished jazz trio. Their notes filled the room, while mine were locked in my chest. The chandelier's glow blurred through my tears. I pressed my napkin to my lap, folding and refolding until the fabric frayed. Every laugh from the crowd sounded like thunder, every note from the trio like an insult. Anna slipped her hand into mine. Her whisper was steady. "They don't know you." "But I do." I squeezed back, clinging to that thread of belief. But my eyes stayed fixed on the piano, untouched. Forbidden, as though my son had nailed its lid shut. And I thought, if dignity can be stolen in front of strangers, what piece of me remains? The jazz trio played on, each note sharp as glass. I sat in the shadows, napkin crumpled in my fist. Daniel's laughter rose above the music, smooth and confident, as if humiliation were his sport. At one point, a colleague approached our table. "Daniel, is this your mother?" he asked, gesturing toward me. Daniel's reply came quick, cutting. "Yes, but she's retired from, well, everything. We keep her comfortable. That's enough." The men chuckled. Their eyes swept over me like appraisers over worn furniture. I forced a polite smile, though my chest throbbed with shame. Comfortable, a word that sounded like a coffin. The waiter poured more champagne. The bubbles fizzed, mocking my silence. I lifted the glass, but my hand shook. Liquid spilled across the white cloth, a stain spreading like accusation. Someone snickered. Anna reached for the glass, steadying it in her small hands. Her eyes burned as she whispered, "Grandma, don't listen to them." I wanted to believe her, but Daniel's voice carried again from the stage. "Folks, tonight is about vision, progress, the future of our company. Not old tunes, not old memories." He paused, letting the words land. Some clap, some laugh softly. And I knew his speech wasn't just for them. It was aimed at me. The chandelier light glared, catching the silver threads of my dress. I felt exposed, ridiculous, a woman out of place in her own son's world. Every cheer from the crowd hammered me smaller, yet inside another sound stirred. Not noise, not silence. A single, stubborn note, the echo of years teaching, writing, surviving. If he thought I was finished, he had forgotten who raised him. Anna leaned close again, her grip on my hand firm. "Someday, they'll hear you," she said. Her voice was steady, almost prophetic. I turned to her, my tears catching the light, and managed the faintest smile. I sat through the rest of the night, a statue among laughter. Every insult tucked itself into my skin, but also into my memory. By the time dessert arrived, I wasn't just humiliated. I was waiting. As guests rose for photos, Daniel strutted across the room, his hand on his wife's shoulder. He didn't look back at me once. And that was the final sting. To be erased while still sitting there. When the lights dimmed and the crowd drifted out, I touched the edge of the untouched piano. Its surface was cool, but beneath it, I felt a pulse. The pulse of something not dead yet. I whispered into the empty hall. They call it noise. But one day I'll make them listen. And as Anna wrapped her arm around mine, helping me toward the door, the humiliation hardened into resolve. This was not my ending. It was only the overture. The gala still echoed in my bones the next morning. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the stain from spilled champagne on my dress. It looked permanent, like humiliation made visible. Anna had gone to school. The house hummed with silence again, yet something inside me refused to sink back into stillness. If Daniel thought I would remain invisible, he underestimated me. I opened the desk drawer, the one I rarely touched except for bills. The scent of old paper rose, dry, musty, tinged with ink. Receipts, letters, check stubs. All neat stacks, all in order. Until now, I noticed the folder labeled, "Retirement Account." The edges were crisp, too new. I had stored the originals in a worn blue folder years ago. Why was this one beige with Daniel's handwriting on the tab? My pulse quickened. I pulled it out, spreading papers across the table. The lamp cast long shadows over the words. At first glance, the statement seemed ordinary. But as my eyes scanned the fine print, a cold wave swept over me. Transfers, withdrawals, dates that didn't match my own records, and at the bottom of one page, a signature. My signature, or rather, something trying to be. The M in Margaret curved too smoothly, the L in Lawson stretched higher than I ever wrote. I traced the ink with a trembling finger. It wasn't mine. I shoved the chair back, the legs screeching across the kitchen floor. The fridge hummed on, oblivious to the earthquake in my chest. My own son hadn't just taken money. He had taken my name, my hand, my trust, and bent them to his will. I rifled deeper through the folder. Pages shuffled, edges scraping like whispers, one after another. Documents bore the same forged marks. The sick realization grew. Daniel wasn't just reckless. He was deliberate. A memory stabbed me? His casual insistence weeks earlier, just sign, Mom. Don't overthink. Had he counted on me never looking back? I pressed my palms flat on the table, steadying myself. The wood felt cold, unyielding, like the truth I had uncovered. For a moment, I closed my eyes, hearing Martin's voice, my late husband, warm and steady. Details, Maggie. Always guard the details. That's where thieves slip in. He had been right, and Daniel had slipped straight into my blind spot. When I opened my eyes again, the forged signature stared back, a mirror of betrayal in black ink. It felt like staring at a stranger wearing my face. I lifted the page higher, the lamplight glowing through the thin paper, making every crooked letter clearer, and my heart whispered the truth I didn't want to say aloud. My own son forged me. The forged signature burned in my hands long after I set the page down. I wanted to shred it, to erase the lie. But the lie was already living in my accounts, twisting itself into my future. I reached deeper into the drawer, pulling out the older blue folder I remembered. Its spine was cracked, edges bent from years of handling. When I laid it beside the beige one Daniel had created, the contrast was a wound. My truth worn and honest, his version neat and poisoned. Page after page revealed discrepancies. A beneficiary line switched, a withdrawal marked as authorized. Key transfers into an account I didn't recognize. Numbers that weren't mine, but bore my name like stolen clothing. My pulse thudded in my ears. I felt the kitchen closing in, walls tilting with the weight of betrayal. Daniel hadn't just silenced my music, he was dismantling my life, one document at a time. I grabbed a notepad, scribbling dates, amounts, bank names. The pencil dug grooves into the paper, as if force alone could anchor the truth. My handwriting looked frantic, but it was mine. That mattered. The house was silent, except for the squeak of the drawer and the rustle of old statements. I heard the clock ticking on the wall, each second daring me to stop. But I couldn't. I needed to know how deep he'd gone. A faint knock startled me. The door creaked open. Anna peeked in, backpack sliding off her shoulder. Her eyes flicked to the papers scattered across the table. "Grandma, what's all this?" Her voice was small, but her presence steadied me. I gestured to the signatures. "They're not mine. Look." She bent close, tracing the loops of ink. Her brows knitted tight. "That's not how you write your M." "I know it." Her certainty cut through the fog of shame. Even a child could see the lie. That meant the truth wasn't gone. It was still visible, if I had the courage to show it. I gathered the forged pages, stacking them with careful hands. My breath came shallow, as if even the walls might overhear. Anna touched my wrist. "Grandma, what will you do?" I stared at the papers, the ink glinting faintly under the lamp. Images flashed Daniel's smirk at the gala, his hand waving me away, the laughter of strangers. What would I do? Not confront him? Not yet. Noise was what he accused me of. So I would give him silence, but a silence with teeth. I slid the most damning documents into an envelope. The paper rasped against the flap, a sound like finality. I placed the envelope into my handbag, feeling its weight settle on my lap. For the first time in weeks, resolve cooled the fire of humiliation. The path ahead was dangerous, but it was mine to walk. Anna leaned against me, her head warm on my arm. "Grandma," she whispered, "promise you won't give up." I kissed the crown of her hair, my voice low but firm. "I won't." When she drifted upstairs, I sat alone again, the envelope heavy at my side. The refrigerator hummed, the clock ticked steady. But beneath those ordinary sounds, a new rhythm beat. Determination. I whispered to the quiet kitchen, words only I was meant to hear. "It's time to know the truth." Sleep no longer came easily. I lay awake in the still house, eyes open to the faint silver wash of moonlight, slipping through the thin curtains. The clock on the wall ticked steady, each second dragging its weight across my chest. The documents sat locked in my handbag by the bed. I could feel them even in the dark, like coals glowing beneath ash. I rolled onto my side, the mattress groaning softly under me. For decades, that bed had carried 2 bodies, 2 breaths, 2 dreams. Now only mine remained, and even that felt half alive. I reached toward the empty space beside me, the space where Martin used to sleep. My palm touched cool sheets. A familiar ache spread. The ache of missing his voice at midnight, the hum of his steady breathing that once anchored me through storms. Closing my eyes, I whispered his name. The silence answered back, but memory filled it quickly. Martin in his flannel shirt, hands dusted with sawdust from the garage. Martin leaning against the doorway as I played piano on quiet evenings, his eyes closed, a faint smile softening his tired face. "Details? Maggie?" he would always say. "Never let them slip through. That's where dignity hides and where thieves crawl in." I used to laugh at his fussing over receipts, but tonight his words throbbed like scripture. I pushed back the covers and rose. The wooden floor creaked beneath my bare feet, the boards cold as stone. The house smelled faintly of old oak and coffee gone stale. Each step toward the hallway was a step deeper into memory. In the corner closet sat a small cedar chest. Martin had carved it himself, the lid etched with faint initials, M&M. My hands shook as I lifted it, the cedar scent sharp, almost medicinal. I carried it to the bed and let the moonlight fall across its surface. Inside lay mementos, our wedding photo curled at the edges, a faded ticket stub from a county fair, letters bound with a fraying ribbon. I untied the knot slowly, the paper dry and fragile under my fingers. One letter slipped free. The ink had browned, but Martin's handwriting remained strong, every loop deliberate. I unfolded it, breath held tight. His words reached across yours, Maggie. If you ever doubt yourself, remember this. You built more than a home. You built a life from music, patience, and grit. Don't let anyone take that from you. Not even family. Especially not family. The words blurred as my eyes stung. Tears dripped onto the page, spreading the ink into soft shadows. I pressed the letter against my chest, hearing his voice echo inside me. It felt as though he had written it for this very night, for this very betrayal. My breath steadied. The achy did not vanish, but it reshaped into something firmer, a quiet resolve. Martin was gone, but his voice remained a compass. I folded the letter carefully, sliding it back beneath the ribbon. But its weight stayed in me, a weight not of grief now, but of direction. I whispered into the moonlight, half to the shadows, half to him, Martin, I hear you. I won't let him win. I set the cedar chest back into the closet, but Martin's words followed me into the living room. The clock read nearly 3 a.m., yet my body hummed with restless energy. I switched on the old lamp by the sofa. Its amber glow spread across the room, throwing shadows long and sharp against the walls. Rain had begun outside, drumming lightly against the shingles, a steady percussion that steadied me. I brewed tea, the kettle shrieking into the silence. The steam rose in slow spirals, the scent of chamomile wrapping around me like a shawl. I cupped the mug between my palms, letting the warmth sink into my bones. For the first time in weeks, the fear didn't drown me. It sharpened me. I pulled out a legal pad and pen. The tip scratched across the paper, lists forming in shaky but determined handwriting. Step 1, confirm accounts. Step 2, gather originals. Step 3, move quietly. Every bullet steadied my heartbeat, every line a promise I made to myself. I remembered Daniel's smirk at the gala, his words about the future, and I pressed harder into the paper. He thought I was finished. He thought age meant weakness, that silence meant surrender, but silence could hold more power than noise if wielded with patience. The rain picked up, tapping harder against the window panes. I rose and pulled the curtains wide. The street outside shimmered under lamplight, puddles gathering along the curb. Somewhere a car passed, its tires hissing across wet asphalt. The world was moving, and so was I. I carried my tea to the hallway mirror. For a moment, I almost didn't recognize the woman staring back. Her hair was thinner, her eyes ringed with sleeplessness, but within them burned something steady, something Daniel hadn't counted on. I whispered to the reflection, testing the sound of resolve in my own voice. He forged my name, he stole my trust, but he hasn't stolen my will. The words didn't tremble. They landed firm, like the first note of a song long waiting to be played. I turned back to the table, slid the forged documents into a second envelope, and sealed it tight. Its weight felt different now, not like a burden, but like a key. I tucked the envelope into my handbag, set the legal pad on top, and blew out the lamp. Darkness returned, but this time it didn't suffocate. It sheltered me. As I passed the mirror one last time, the rainlight glinting across my face, I stopped and looked straight into my own eyes. It starts now, I told her, and for once, the woman in the mirror believed me. The morning after the sleepless night, I dressed carefully, gray slacks, navy sweater, low heels. Nothing dramatic, nothing to draw attention. I needed to look ordinary, just another woman handling errands. The envelope sat in my handbag, its edges pressing against the leather. It felt heavier than its paper weight, like a stone in my lap as I drove downtown. The bank lobby smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant cleaner. A Christmas wreath still hung above the glass doors, though January had already set in. The quiet hum of printers and clicking keyboards mixed with the muffled conversations of customers. I approached the counter, my voice steady. I'd like to review some account records. With a manager, if possible. The teller, a young man with tired eyes, nodded and led me to a small office. Inside, a woman in her 40s greeted me, her blazer sharp, her smile rehearsed but polite. "Mrs. Lawson, how can I help today?" I placed the envelope on her desk, sliding a few pages forward. "These are recent statements. Something doesn't match my own records. And the signatures. I need you to compare them with the originals you have on file." She adjusted her glasses, pulled my documents closer, the room filled with the scratch of her pen, the shuffle of folders from her cabinet. Each sound wound my nerves tighter. At last, she set 2 pages side by side. One bore my true signature from years ago, clean and deliberate. The other, the forged one, wobbled with imitation, her brow furrowed. "Her Mrs. Lawson, this doesn't align with our signature card. See here?" She tapped the loops of the M. "Someone tried, but it isn't consistent." The air thinned around me. Hearing it confirmed by another voice was different than whispering it to myself. It was no longer paranoia. It was proof. "Can you tell me?" I asked, my throat tight. "Who authorized these withdrawals?" She flipped through her system, the keys clacking under her fingers. Her eyes darted, then narrowed. "According to this, authorization was provided by you, but the ID copy on file is dated 3 months ago. Was that you, ma'am?" "No," I said, firmer than I expected. "I haven't submitted new ID in over a decade." She leaned back, lips pressed thin. For a moment, she looked less like a banker and more like a woman waiting something personal. "Mrs. Lawson," she said softly, "I shouldn't be telling you this until we escalate. But you need to know. This pattern doesn't look accidental. It looks planned." Her words landed like stones. Planned. The betrayal had shape now, edges I could hold. I steadied my hands on the desk, though they trembled beneath the surface. "Can I have copies of those?" "Oh," she hesitated, then nodded. The printer whirred, spitting out crisp white sheets. The smell of hot toner filled the air. She slipped them into a folder, pushing it gently toward me. I reached for it, my fingertips brushing the slick surface, and in that instant, I knew this was the first piece of truth I could carry outside my home. Her voice dropped lower, as if the walls might be listening. "Take care, Mrs. Lawson. Whoever did this knew what they were doing." I clutched the folder to my chest, the sound of the printer still echoing in my ears. This wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was documented theft, ink and paper betraying my own blood. The folder pressed against my side as I walked out of the bank. Rain still slicked the sidewalks, the air carrying that sharp smell of wet asphalt and cold metal. Each step felt heavier, but for the first time, heavy with purpose. In the car, I flipped the folder open again. The copies were still warm from the printer. The ink looked so clean, so final, as if betrayal itself had been notarized. I slid the folder back into the envelope, sealed it tight, and whispered to myself, "No more blind trust." Back home, I carried the envelope to the small safe in my closet. The combination lock clicked beneath my fingers, each turn measured, deliberate. The heavy door groaned open, releasing the faint metallic scent of stored air. Inside rested old jewelry boxes, a few savings bonds, and now, my first weapon of proof. I placed the folder on top, shut the door, and turned the dial until silence confirmed it was mine alone. Then I sat at the kitchen table with my checkbook. For years, Daniel had called, asking for short-term help, car repairs, mortgage gaps, school tuition for Anna, though I later learned most of that came from Martin's old life insurance. Not Daniel's effort. Every time I wrote checks with shaking hands, telling myself family came first. Every time, I believed I was holding him up, but the truth was uglier. I had been funding my own erasure. I opened the ledger, lines of ink marking years of generosity. Then I drew one final line across the page. Dark, bold, unbroken. The end of it. At the bank earlier, I had quietly instructed the manager freeze joint access, send no notices to Daniel's address, flag all withdrawals for my personal approval. She hesitated, but after seeing the forgeries, she complied. It was the first real cut string. The house felt different already? Quieter, but not hollow. Quieter like a room after broken glass has been swept away. Anna hummed upstairs, a tune I recognized from my own playing. The sound steadied me. I brewed another pot of coffee, the rich aroma filling the kitchen. Steam curled upward, fogging the window where rain traced crooked lines. I sipped slowly, letting the bitterness ground me. Daniel would call soon, maybe asking for help with next month's bills, his voice polished with charm. But I was ready. Every yes had ended tonight. I looked down at my hands. Veins raised, skin loose, but stronger than he ever imagined. These hands had played through loss, cooked through lean years, held babies through fevers. Now they held something else, resolve. I whispered into the dim kitchen, to the memory of Martin, to myself, to the silence that had become my armor. I will no longer fund my own erasure. And then, as if speaking beyond the walls of my home, I turned the question outward, to anyone who has ever felt invisible at their own table. What would you do? Cut ties quietly, or confront out loud? The morning came sharp and cold. Light spilled across the kitchen floor, pale winter sunlight pressing through the thin curtains. I sat at the table in my robe, the envelope of documents spread before me. It was the day everything would change, the day of the cutoff. I brewed coffee strong, the bitter steam curling against my face. Every sip steadied my nerves, every swallow burned resolve deeper. The house was silent, except for the rustle of papers as I checked my list again. Legal pad notes, account numbers, the forged signatures in their folders, all lined up like soldiers waiting for command. At 8 sharp, I dialed the bank. The phone clicked, a ring stretching longer than usual. Finally, the manager's voice answered, calm and efficient. Mrs. Lawson, we've reviewed your requests. Are you ready to proceed? My hand tightened around the receiver. Yes, today. All of it? Her voice lowered, steady but weighty. We'll finalize the transfer to your private account and revoke the secondary access. You'll receive fresh cards and updated records by courier. From this morning forward, no one else can authorize withdrawals. The words struck like a drumbeat. I imagined Daniel trying his next smooth withdrawal, his smile faltering when the system rejected him. For years, my silence had been his permission. Today, silence became my weapon. I laid the phone down, my fingers trembling against the cool plastic. The kitchen felt different, lighter, as if the walls had exhaled with me. I closed my eyes, hearing Martin's voice steady in memory. Details, Maggie. Don't let them slip. Next came the lawyer. I carried the documents to the den, spreading them across the oak desk. The room smelled faintly of dust and lemon polish. I dialed, each number deliberate. When he answered, I kept my voice calm. I want to update my will and protective measures. Today, he asked questions, his pen scratching in the background. I provided details. The forged papers, the accounts, the bank's confirmation. Each fact fell into place like bricks forming a wall. By the time we ended the call, a structure of defense surrounded me. I gathered the documents into neat stacks, slipped them back into their envelopes. The sound of paper rasping against paper was sharp, almost satisfying. I rose and carried them to the safe, the lock clicking closed with finality. The clock on the wall struck 10. 2 hours into the day, and already the strings had been cut tighter than ever before. The phone rang again. I answered quickly. The bank manager's tone carried both formality and certainty. As of today, Mrs. Lawson, only you have control. The words settled in my chest like stone, but not heavy this time. Solid, protective, undeniable. The cutoff had begun. By noon the sky had turned overcast, clouds pressing low, casting the living room in gray. I sat in my armchair, hands folded around a mug of lukewarm coffee, when the phone rang. Its sharp trill cut the quiet. I knew before I answered who it would be. Mum! Daniel's voice exploded through the line, all charm stripped away. My card just got declined. What's going on? The bank says the account is restricted. I let the silence breathe for a moment, counting heartbeats before answering evenly. Perhaps you should ask them, Daniel. I only know what belongs to me is now safe. He slammed something on his end. A desk, maybe? The thud carrying even across the distance. You can't just do this. We have bills. Anna's tuition, the mortgage. Don't you care what happens to us? The words struck, but they no longer pierced. I thought of Martin's letter, of years writing checks while Daniel promised change. Promises had become smoke. Today, smoke was no longer currency. I shifted the receiver, my thumb tapping lightly against the cord. "Daniel?" I said softly. "I've cared enough for a lifetime. Now I care for myself." For a heartbeat, there was only static. Then came his laugh. Not amused, but edge sharp as broken glass. "So this is it. You think you can control everything. You're old, Mom. You don't understand how the world works anymore?" With the insult might once have cracked me open. Now it sounded hollow, a desperate boy banging on a locked door. I stood, carrying the phone to the window. Outside, a pale beam of light broke through the clouds, cutting across the wet street. I watched it spread, thin but undeniable. "You'll find the world works differently today," I told him, "very differently." He shouted again, a string of words hot with anger, but I had stopped listening. I let his voice roll past, like distant thunder that promised no rain. Then, gently, I lowered the receiver back to its cradle. The click of disconnection echoed in the room, louder than his shouting had been. I stood still, watching the curtains stir faintly with a draft. For the first time in years, power sat in my hands, quiet and firm. I whispered to the silence, to Martin, to myself, "Tomorrow, he'll see the truth." By evening, the wind had picked up, rattling the branches against the windows. The house smelled faintly of cedar and old varnish, a scent that deepened when the furnace kicked on. I was stacking the last envelope of documents on the coffee table when pounding shook the front door. "Mom! Open this door right now." Daniel's voice cut through the night. Harsh, urgent, no pretense left. I smoothed my sweater, walked slowly, and unlocked the door. He pushed past me, bringing with him the sharp chill of winter air. His eyes darted around the living room, landing on the papers spread across the table. "What is this? Why are you doing this to me?" I closed the door gently, the latch clicking in final punctuation. "This isn't about doing something to you, Daniel. It's about ending what you've done to me." He moved to the table, snatching one of the copies. This is nothing. You're confused. Anyone could make a mistake signing their name." But his hands shook as he held the page. The forged loops of my M glared back at both of us under the yellow lamplight. I sat down in the armchair, gestured toward the couch. "Sit. You need to hear this quietly." He didn't sit, just paced, rubbing his temples. "Mom, if you go through with this, you'll ruin us. You'll ruin me." I lifted another document, the letter from the lawyer, confirming the transfer of full control. "Read it, Daniel." "It's already done?" The paper fluttered from my fingers to the table. He stared at it, color draining from his face. For the first time in years, he looked less like a man in charge and more like a boy caught with his hand in the till. "You can't," he started, but his voice cracked. Then it softened, turning to a plea. "Please, Mom, we can work something out. I'll stop. Just don't cut me off completely." I studied him, every line of his face. The desperation, the sweat at his temples, the way his fists kept unclenching. All the years of giving, all the years of being erased. They ended in this moment. I stood, my knees stiff but unyielding. I looked him in the eye. "It's over? No more checks? No more lies? You'll find your own way now." The wind howled against the windows as silence filled the room between us. At last, Daniel dropped the papers onto the table, his shoulders sagging. Without another word, he turned and walked out, the slam of the door echoing through the house. I stood alone in the quiet. The documents spread like a shield before me. The lamplight glowed warm on the pages, and the old wood of the floor creaked softly under my feet. I whispered to the empty room, to Martin's memory, to the truth that had finally spoken for itself. Justice doesn't need noise, only truth. The next morning arrived without shouting, without phone calls, without Daniel's footsteps on my porch. The silence carried a weight of its own. But it was a softer weight, like a quilt draped across tired shoulders. I brewed chamomile tea instead of coffee, watching the steam curl lazily above the cup. The kitchen smelled of dried flowers and honey. Through the window, the wind rattled bare branches, and the sky stretched pale, washed clean after the storm of the night before. For the first time in months, I didn't feel hunted in my own home. I felt empty, yes, but also unburdened. I walked through the living room. The papers were gone, locked away again in the safe. Only the quiet remained, and the faint impression of Daniel's anger still clinging to the walls. I touched the back of the couch, my hand steady. "Let the dust settle?" I murmured. The phone rang twice that day. Once from the bank, confirming new protections were fully active. Once from Rachel, her voice clipped, brittle. "We'll be fine without your interference," she said quickly, then hung up before I could respond. Their withdrawal felt less like rejection now, and more like a door closing behind me. A necessary one. By afternoon, Emily arrived. Her knock was gentle, her smile cautious when I opened the door. She slipped inside, her backpack slung over one shoulder. The scent of her vanilla lip balm filled the air as she leaned in to hug me. "Grandma?" she whispered. "I heard Dad yelling last night." I didn't know what to do. We sat at the table together. I poured her tea, and the warmth of the cup seemed to ease her hands. The light through the curtains framed her face. Still young, but carrying the strain of being caught between. "I'm sorry you had to hear that," I told her. "But Emily, some truths need to come out loud so the lies can finally stop." Her eyes watered, but she nodded. "I just don't want to lose you too." I reached across, laying my hand over hers. Her skin was warm, steadying. "Sweetheart, you won't lose me. Not now. Not ever." But I had to protect myself, or there would have been nothing left for you to hold on to. We sat in silence for a moment, the clock ticking softly, the tea cooling in our cups. The house no longer felt hollow. It felt, strangely, like a place being reset. Emily squeezed my hand, her voice firmer than I expected. "Grandma, you don't have to face the rest alone." The light shifted as the afternoon waned, casting long bars of gold across the kitchen table. Emily still held my hand, her grip warm, steady, a tether pulling me away from the emptiness that had shadowed me for so long. She took a breath. "Grandma, have you thought about what comes next? I mean, now that everything's out in the open." I looked around the house. The wallpaper Martin and I had picked 40 years ago still clung to the hallway walls. The worn piano in the corner sat silent, keys yellowed but loyal, memories draped over every surface. Yet beneath them, a question hummed: was this place my sanctuary now, or my cage? "I have thought about it," I admitted. "Some nights I wondered if selling the house was the only way forward. But this is the home where you took your first steps, where your grandfather and I built every season of our lives." Emily leaned back, her eyes scanning the room with me. "It's beautiful, Grandma, but it's not the walls that keep you safe. It's the choices you make inside them." Her words struck deeper than she knew. For years I had let others' choices drown mine. Now the air itself felt different. Lighter, as if my own voice had cracked a window open. I rose, walked to the counter, and pulled out a plate of cookies I had baked earlier. The scent of cinnamon and butter filled the room. Emily grinned as I set the plate between us. We each took one, the crunch soft, crumbs scattering across the table. While we ate, I drew a pad of paper closer, tapping a pen against the margin. I thought I might start listing options. Keep the house, or maybe downsize, move somewhere near the coast. I could still play piano in a smaller room. Emily's laughter chimed, light but genuine. "Grandma, you'd fill any room with music. It doesn't matter if it's a concert hall or a tiny cottage." I smiled, feeling something in my chest ease. It wasn't about loss anymore. It was about choice. We talked until the sky darkened, sketching possibilities. A community center where I might teach, a trip we could take together, the idea of converting Martin's study into a music nook for Emily. Each idea layered hope over the bruises of betrayal. When evening finally folded in, I looked at her and said, "Whatever happens, Emily, I want you to remember this: I am not done living. I am not done choosing." Oh, she hugged me then, her hair smelling faintly of lavender shampoo. Her heartbeat pressed against mine, quick but sure. As I held her, I realized the storm had truly passed. The fallout was not destruction. It was a calm, a clearing. I set the pen down, the page filled with possibilities, and whispered to myself, to Martin, to the quiet house that was now truly mine. I allow myself a new beginning. The first morning of my new chapter felt different. The sun rose over Asheville with a softness I hadn't felt in years, pouring golden light through the wide windows of the community center. Dust motes floated in the beams, dancing as if the air itself was celebrating. I stood in the hall, my hand brushing across the polished wood of the upright piano that had been delivered the day before. The scent of varnish and fresh polish filled the room, mixing with the faint aroma of coffee drifting from the lobby. It was a simple space, no chandeliers, no velvet curtains. But it belonged to me. Emily bustled at my side, unpacking a stack of sheet music. Her laughter echoed lightly, filling the corners that had long sat empty. She laid the pages neatly across the music stand. "You're really doing this, Grandma. You're opening your own class." I smiled at her wonder, feeling the corners of my heart stretch in ways they hadn't in decades. "Yes, darling. Music saved me. Now it will belong to others too." The first students arrived slowly, a handful of children clutching books. A young mother who confessed she'd always dreamed of learning, an older gentleman with stiff hands but eager eyes. They filed in with shy smiles, and I greeted each one as though they were family. We began simply, hands positioned on keys, fingers curled. The first note stumbled out awkward, clumsy but honest. I guided them gently, each correction soft, each encouragement firm. As they played, the room filled with sound. Not perfect music, but raw beginnings. It was more beautiful than any polished recital I had ever attended. Between lessons, I rested my hands on the keys, let a few chords ring out. The piano's voice was warm, resonant against the high ceiling. I thought of Martin, how he had told me my notes would outlive us. He was right. Emily leaned closer, her whisper brushed against my ear. "Grandma, this is just the beginning?" I looked at her, the reflection of light shimmering in her eyes, and I believed her. For the first time, my legacy wasn't a will waiting to be read. It was alive, singing in the very air around us. A month later, the community center smelled faintly of paper programs and floor polish. Chairs lined the hall, filled with neighbors and families. The evening light streamed through high windows, casting a honey-colored glow across the stage where the piano waited. I didn't sit at the bench that night. Instead, I chose a seat in the back row, my hands folded in my lap, heart beating with a strange mix of pride and calm. Emily stood at the piano, her fingers poised with quiet confidence. Beside her, the children shuffled nervously, their sheet music clutched like treasure. The young mother gave a brave smile to her toddler in the front row. The older gentleman flexed his stiff fingers, determined to press through the notes. Then it began. The first chords rang out, hesitant, uneven. But soon the sounds braided together, each student carrying a piece of the melody I had written years ago. The melody that had kept me alive on lonely nights, the one Daniel had once called noise. Now it soared. Emily guided them with steady rhythm, her own playing rich and sure. She looked up once, meeting my eyes across the hall, and I knew Martin would have been proud. I felt him there, woven into every note, every breath of music that filled the room. When the last chord lingered into silence, the audience erupted in applause. Clapping, whistling, cheers bouncing off the walls. The children bowed awkwardly. The older man dabbed at his eyes with a handkerchief. The young mother laughed through her tears. I rose slowly, letting the sound wash over me. It wasn't just applause for them. It was an answer to the years of doubt, to the years of silence forced upon me. I didn't need revenge anymore. I had something greater. Healing, empowerment, a legacy living in each of them. Emily came running down the aisle afterward, throwing her arms around me. "Grandma, they loved it?" she whispered, her voice trembling with joy. "Yes, darling," I said, my cheek against her hair. And so did I. The hall emptied slowly, leaving only the echo of music behind. I lingered, breathing in the scent of sheet music and worn wood, listening to the silence that was no longer empty. It was full. I turned to the door, my steps unhurried, my spirit lighter than it had been in decades. Justice had come quietly, healing had followed, And now, a legacy sang into the future. If you've ever felt dismissed, erased, or told your song didn't matter, listen closely. Your voice is still here. Share your story. You're not alone. Looking back, I no longer see only the sting of betrayal. I see the steps that carried me here, the quiet nights at the piano, the tears that watered strength I didn't know I had, the moment truth spoke louder than lies. Daniel's laughter, Rachel's coldness, they once carved hollows in me. But hollows can be filled, and I filled mine with music, with teaching, with the gentle hands of a granddaughter who refused to let me fade. Justice came quietly, not in shouts or vengeance, but in firm choices, in locked safes and signed letters, in the calm of knowing I would no longer be erased. Healing followed in the simplest of ways, children pressing piano keys for the first time, neighbors clapping in a sunlit hall, Emily's whisper, "Grandma, this is just the beginning. I am 72, and my life is not over. It is rewritten note by note, choice by choice. My legacy is not the money Daniel once chased. It is the music that will outlive me, the dignity I reclaimed, the truth that silence can hold power when spoken at the right time." So if you've ever been told you are invisible, if someone tried to reduce your worth to nothing, remember your story is not finished. Stand, speak, create. Share your story. You're not alone.